When Opal Lee was 10 years old, her family moved her and her two younger siblings from Marshall, Texas to Fort Worth. But 2 years later, when Lee was just 12 years old, an angry mob of white rioters burned down her home, angry at the black family for moving into a predominantly white neighborhood.
People started gathering across the street, and the paper says it was 500 people. Those people drug the furniture out and burned it. They did despicable things.
That night was June 19th, 1939. Juneteenth. "77 years later, at 89 years old, Opal Lee embarked on a journey from Fort Worth to Washington, D.C. in the hopes of convincing lawmakers to mark June 19th as a federal holiday. Today, Opal Lee is known as the grandmother of Juneteenth. I'm Cheyenne Daniels, race and politics reporter for The Hill, and this is The Switch Up. Today, we're talking about Juneteenth. What happened on June 19th, 1865? How did Juneteenth become a federal holiday? And why do we still celebrate the day nearly 160 years later? For more than 400 years, over 15 million Africans were the victims of the transatlantic slave trade, according to data from the United Nations. Statista, a German-led database, estimates that there were 700,000 slaves in the U.S. in 1790, or about 18% of the total population. By 1860, when the last census before the Civil War was taken, there were 4 million slaves in the South. But 3 years later, on January 1st, 1863, President Abraham Lincoln made history by signing the Emancipation Proclamation. When Lincoln signed the historical proclamation declaring that all persons held as slaves within the rebellious states are and henceforward shall be free, cannon shots fired and church bells rang. New Year's Day, which was referred to as Heartbreak Day among many enslaved people because of the slave auctions often held around that time, would instead be known as a day of deliverance and jubilee. But it would take until June 19, 1865, for news of the emancipation to reach the enslaved and slave owners in Galveston, Texas. When news finally came to Texas, the day became known as Emancipation Day, Freedom Day, or simply Juneteenth. But when Lincoln signed the Emancipation, that freedom was still limited.
The Emancipation Proclamation was to declare liberation of formerly enslaved people in Confederate states. Let's be clear about that. It was not designed to free slaves in the Union states, only in those Confederate states, of which Texas was one of those.
That's Jared Howard, CEO and visionary of the National Juneteenth Museum in Texas, about 35 minutes outside of Dallas.
And so the Emancipation Proclamation was signed on January 1st, 1863. It was 2.5 years later, June 19th, 1865, that General Gordon Granger arrived in Galveston with Union troops to enforce the emancipation of the formerly enslaved people in Texas. And again, Texas being the last bastion of slavery amongst the Confederate states. And so it's a very significant day in history, but I want to make sure that people get it right. It did not represent the end of slavery in the United States as we know it. That happened with the ratification of the 13th Amendment later in 1865.
It's not exactly clear why it took so long for news of the emancipation to reach Texans, but Howard said historians have two schools of thought. The first, they just didn't have the technology to communicate quickly in the 1800s. There were no phone calls that could be made, or emails to send, or social media platforms to post on to tell the enslaved that they were free. But the second school of thought, according to Howard, is that the emancipation was known by slave owners for those 2 years, but it took 2 years before Union soldiers came to enforce the proclamation.
I can't imagine any scenario where it should have taken 2.5 years for the information to be received. And so the popular school of thought is that the enforcement was the piece that was missing, because let's be clear, the people in Texas and the other Confederate states were not happy about slavery ending. And so without some enforcement, it probably wasn't going to end the way it was designed in the Emancipation Proclamation. So again, on June 19th, 1865, Union General Gordon Granger arrived with several thousands of Union troops to enforce the Emancipation Proclamation and to require the people in Texas and Galveston, beautiful city, South Texas, that listen, not only has the Emancipation Proclamation been signed, but you're going to respect it. And if you choose not to respect it, then you will suffer dire consequences, hence the presence of the troops. And so that enforcement was necessary.
The city of Galveston has celebrated Juneteenth since 1866, but the push to make the day a federal holiday dates back more than 100 years from today. Newspaper articles from early celebrations recount African Americans celebrating the day with a dinner and discussion and marches through the streets. In 1872, a group of African American ministers and businessmen in Houston bought 10 acres of land and declared the property be deemed Emancipation Park to be used for annual Juneteenth celebrations. In 1879, then-Republican Texas State Representative Robert Evans tried to pass legislation declaring Juneteenth a holiday, but it took 100 years before former Democratic State Representative Albert Eli Edwards, who became known as Mr. Juneteenth, authored House Bill 1016 to make Juneteenth a paid holiday in the Lone Star State. And it wasn't really until the murder of George Floyd by Minneapolis police officers in 2020 that recognition of Juneteenth began to spread nationwide, said Frederick Knight, a professor of history at Morehouse College.
There was a lot of interest in nonprofit sector, people who have been doing work in the Black Lives Matter movement, as well as now with people huddled and socially distanced during the pandemic, the sense of now what do we do? And so you began to see corporations, foundations, and the like say, well, what are we going to do in terms of racial reckoning? And so this became a place where corporate corporations, again, foundations, others who are interested in engaging in this racial reckoning began to see themselves and inserted themselves in the conversation. And so you saw that, and then you also saw the mass media pick up on this holiday as well, which had been celebrated for some time. It had waxed and waned in African-American communities. Of course, it was a movement to turn Juneteenth into a national holiday. One of the central figures was Opal Lee, who would start a movement around 2016 to get petitions. And she got about 1 million people sign petitions to make Juneteenth a national holiday. But it really was the racial reckoning of the summer of 2020 that put it on a national radar. And then with Biden's presidency, he in many ways fulfilled that promise, at least one of the promises of that summer of racial reckoning.
Lee, who still holds the pen Biden used to sign Juneteenth into a federal holiday, worked with another name that often goes unheard, Ronald Myers. Myers worked for more than 25 years in the push to federally recognize Juneteenth, even establishing the Juneteenth Observance Foundation. But he died in 2018, 3 years before Juneteenth became a federal holiday. But since becoming an official federal holiday in 2021, there has clearly been pushback to Black history. 44 states have introduced bills to restrict teaching critical race theory or to limit how teachers can discuss racism and sexism, according to an Education Week analysis. African American history programs in Florida's public schools are now required to teach students that Black people benefited from slavery because it taught them useful skills. In 2022, a conservative Tennessee parent group sued local and state education leaders for curriculum that it said is replete with racial discrimination age-inappropriate material that causes children guilt, anguish, and other forms of psychological harm. It discusses the United States as an irredeemably racist country and is overall hyper-focused on racial indoctrination.
It's important for us to teach Black history because our culture continued to carry the community forward, right? Like, we are the culture in America, right? We are the trendsetters. We are the ones who are advocating not just for our communities, but for all communities.
That's Wisdom Cole, Senior National Director of Advocacy for the NAACP. Though Black America has seen a lot of progress over the last few years, including the appointment of the first Black woman to the Supreme Court, to billions forgiven in student loan debt, the pushback has also come more into focus. But Dr. Knight says that the pushback should be somewhat unsurprising.
Whenever, we make 2 steps forward, there's 1 step back, and we should just anticipate this. We know that race has been one of the central dividing lines in American history. And there's just no denying that. All you have to do is spend a couple of hours in any library or archive related to Southern history, American history. You just see how race is really just ribbon throughout the country's history. And so we know that this has been one of the underbellies of American history, right? And so we're dealing with questions of identity, American national identity. And there's these tensions between a sense of, the United States kind of common experience, common set of values, institutions, and a culture, as well as recognizing the injustices and the divisions within American history. And then there's also the developmental process. And so you're talking about young people, and sometimes there's debates about what should you expose to young people, at what time should you expose certain things related to racism or injustice and violence. It's been kind of a constant in American history. And during the 1960s and 1970s, there was a sense that we want to get, particularly on the wave of the civil rights movement and the civil rights activists, you saw a proliferation of research and courses on the Black experience during the 1970s and 1980s. At the same time, there was also a political backlash that was occurring in the United States. And so you saw, of course, the splitting of the Democratic Party, where white Southerners would join the Republican Party. So the Republican Party was reshaped and reformed. And there was also, again, this backlash against what was happening in the 1960s that was trying to resolve this question of racial segregation and division in the country. And so what we saw then, and over the course of a couple of decades and toward the end of the 20th century, is a consolidation of that right-wing movement and conservative movement. At the same time, you saw in higher education a growth in the field of African American history and African American studies. And that, again, it all hit a crescendo in the first couple of decades of this century with the rise of the Tea Party movement, the rise of 45th President of the United States. And it was really as a result of executive order that he would issue that said that federal agencies should not promote equity and diversity training that would feed a kind of narrative and feed a political base. And then from there, it proliferated. And then from there, it became something that other politicians, most probably famously Governor DeSantis of Florida, would use as a way of ginning up his political base. And so, again, these things come in waves, right? And so history, the historical process, the process of kind of forward movement and progress is not always linear. There are oftentimes these backward steps, there's oftentimes resistance. And what we're seeing in reaction to inclusion of Black history in the curriculum and African American studies is kind of a latest wave of this resistance.
Those against teaching Black history or programs promoting diversity, equity, and inclusion often argue it's divisive. But Knight pushed back on that notion, saying Black history isn't divisive, but it does take a sense of bravery to tell it wholly and truthfully.
The goal is not divisiveness. The goal is to see the extent to which African Americans' lives have been very much part of the fabric of the United States, and how African Americans have tried as much as possible to bridge the divides. That's the irony, the bridge the divides that other forces have tried to create.
Teaching the legacy of Juneteenth, especially when so many may be unaware of what the day represents, can be a way to build culture, says Cole.
I've taken trips down to Galveston and seen the Juneteenth Museum, right? I have connected with members of the community and how they've talked how important it is for not just only our community to recognize this, but for all communities to recognize this, right? This is a part about building a culture that is ingrained with the fabric of America, right? The same way we talk about Black history being American history, Juneteenth is American history, right? And when we think about these things that have changed the way that our culture is created, we have to be able to give the flowers to those who are making the way for that in real time. You know, it has to be more than just a day, right? The impacts of Juneteenth and the impacts of freedom have to exist in our classrooms, exist in our boardrooms, exist in every single hall of power, and ensure that there's opportunity for Black people to have access to that. You know, Juneteenth's legacy has to be more than just a day, more than just a day of rest. It has to be an opportunity for us to access the future that we so deserve here in America.
But as Black history has become politicized, Black political leaders are taking a stand this week. For Nevada Democratic Representative Stephen Horsford, chairman of the Congressional Black Caucus, Juneteenth is more than just a day off of work.
It's really a day for us to remember what freedom means, why it is still so important to protect and to preserve, particularly at a time when there are forces trying to take away our freedom, our rights, and opportunities for Black America and for other marginalized communities. This week is, again, more than just a holiday for us. It's a week of action, in fact. Members of Congress in the CBC, the House Democratic Caucus, in partnership with the Vice President and the President, we will be doing events all throughout our districts to uplift the work of freedom. Freedom for students to learn our full history, the freedom for people to thrive economically, to start businesses, to own homes, to invest in their communities, the freedom to love who you love as we recognize Pride Month, and the freedom for women to continue to have the right to make their own healthcare choices over their body. At a time when these freedoms are under assault and being eroded, and when there are efforts to take away those freedoms, we believe that it's not only a time to honor the holiday of Juneteenth, but what it means and what it signifies, and the fact that every generation has to continue to fight to protect our freedom. Black America wants the same thing as any other community. We want to thrive. We don't want to just survive, we want to thrive. This country was built on the backs of free labor, of enslaved people. And Juneteenth is a recognition of the fact that they did earn their freedom, but that the systemic racism, discrimination, policies, and institutions did not allow them to really live free. So the freedom that they gained in one way was still denied in other ways. And so when we talk about generational wealth today, it's because we're trying to overcome those inequities that have existed in our country, sadly, for over 400 years.
I'm your host, Cheyenne Daniels, race and politics reporter for The Hill. And from all of us at The Hill, thanks for listening to this episode of The Switch Up. We'll have more episodes delving into the intersection of race and politics soon, so be sure to follow The Hill at THEHILL on all social media for future updates, including episode drops and articles. And you can listen to my full interviews with all of our guests on YouTube. The Switch Up was created and written by me. Script editing for this episode was done by Steph Thomas. Our booking producers are Casey Brady and Eden Tishome. Our social media manager is Tia Shepard.